welcome again to Espria podcast. Brian Sibley here again, and once again I've got Jon from Sophos. Welcome back, Jon.
Thank you for having me back.
Okay, so this episode I think we want to talk about how ransomware gets in. We've done a lot about the stats of what happens when people have been attacked, but let's understand how the ransomware gets in, I suppose. So what's the sort of root cause analysis we've picked up? Is there any one thing that's been causing a problem? I'm assuming not.
If only it were that easy, this would be a very short episode. Unfortunately, the reality is that there are a lot of factors, and some of those are technology related and some of those are more human related. So if we look at the technology reasons behind attacks, the first one in terms of popularity from a cybercriminal's perspective is the exploited vulnerability. We still see that being 32% of successful attacks. To explain what an exploited vulnerability is, this is essentially where the cyber criminals have a known vulnerability, a known exploit, something that's wrong with software on a machine that they can utilize that coding flaw to execute their nefarious deeds. And in an ideal world, those exploits wouldn't be available. Either they were stopped in production or organizations would patch better. So every time a device is going through an update process, as well as maybe having new features added, we're also seeing those loopholes that have been discovered being closed off. And what that means is the cyber criminals, in theory, shouldn't be able to leverage an attack against those particular flaws. You would look at that and assume that it is a technology problem alone. And actually, it's probably a little bit of a blend, because most organizations know they should be patching, but they fail to do it successfully, either because of a lack of human resources in terms of time, or also the skills and the capabilities to be able to patch successfully. But if we were patching better, we would probably experience less ransomware. That's the first takeaway. There is also a lot of human factors. So the next most common exploit methodology is actually then related to compromised credentials, which is definitely a human problem. And those credentials are either weak to start with, or increasingly those credentials have been harvested or stolen by the cyber criminal. So this would typically involve some kind of social engineering to get a user to divulge their password, whether that be a fake help desk call or whether that's a fake website that's prompting you to log in. Whatever the mechanism is, those user details are being stolen and then leveraged against an organization. And this presents a very big problem for detection technologies, because how on earth could you expect technology to tell the difference between legitimate logins versus a cyber criminals impersonating one of your users and using their identity against the organization? Very difficult, if not impossible, for technology to work on that.
The username's right, the password's right. For all intents and purposes, it's a genuine login. Yeah.
Precisely, yeah. And then if we look a little bit further down the chain, then I'm going to bundle the next two in together, which would be phishing and malicious emails. This, again, both cases requires human interaction, whether it be social engineering or whether it be some malicious content actually embedded in the email. It would typically require some kind of human interaction. And this is where user training is really important, because if we train our users to recognize the signs that something isn't right, they are less likely to interact with the emails and therefore keep the organization safe. However, it's not as straightforward as you might think, because it used to be the case that spotting phishing was, in relative terms, easy. We would be looking for things like poor grammar, badly formatted English, broken English. Yeah. And this is where AI is very heavily used by the cyber criminals. Because let's be honest, in most cases, the perpetrators of these attacks, their native tongue is not English. However, AI can very effectively allow cyber criminals to craft emails that have the appropriate language. But more than that, AI can also be trained to recognize brand tone of voice, recognize brand logos and styles, and then very effectively replicate leading brands that organizations and individuals trust, so that those phishing attacks are more likely to be successful.
Yeah. They're obviously more targeted now. They're doing the research beforehand, understanding how that business communicates.
Well, that's another aspect as well. So as well as impersonating brands and just assuming that people will click on those things, then there is also that investigation process. So cyber criminals call this open source intelligence, but it is basically cyber spying on victim organizations, working out who the key people are, looking at how they communicate, what business they're in, what activities are going on, and then using that background knowledge to create a phishing attack which will fit individuals' realities very effectively, so that they're much more inclined to click on the links or do the bad things. And this is important that we understand really that people who interact with this stuff, they're not stupid. And we shouldn't look at them in that way. We should look at them from a perspective of actually trying to train them and enable them better. But no matter how much you train your users, expecting 100% success rates is unrealistic, because these attacks are very convincing, very convincing.
They're very sophisticated now, and we all know we're busy and we are waiting for that DHL parcel. It's very easy to go, oh, here's a notification, I'm just going to click on that. Oh dear, it's been held in customs. I need to log in to check my details, and you've just lost your credentials.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one of the places you can win here is looking at the organization and what you publish online. So all that information that you use can be gathered up and used against you. And that applies to everybody's personal lives as well as their professional lives.
I think it's education overall. It's cyber education in your personal life as well as business. That's really interesting. So the phishing is still there very much. It's still a big thing. Okay, but I think so vulnerability management is obviously a key thing here. It's getting those vulnerabilities identified and rectified in a timely fashion. I think that's the key thing, isn't it? As you say, people know they're there. Yeah, I'll do that at the next patching interval or when I get round to it.
Absolutely. It's also interesting to look at some of the operational challenges that organizations face as well. So we see a large number of victim organizations citing things like not having the appropriate skill sets, not having the time to dedicate to cybersecurity, or in some cases actually having security gaps, either acknowledged gaps that organizations have just accepted that's a risk and we can't afford to cover it, or in many cases, ransomware attacks actually expose weak spots and areas that victim organizations just simply hadn't considered, and it blindsides them effectively. And actually, when we look at operational challenges, it's usually a blend of several things, but operational factors definitely include skill sets, the time, and having the right technologies in place.
Absolutely. I suppose that really then segues into how do we build a better defense? Tools we need to put in place. So I suppose things like prevention, detection, response planning, what tools we'd be looking at there.
Well, the biggest tool is actually something that most organizations will already have, and that is the security data coming from the technology that they've invested in. So everything in your network will be creating logs. Your endpoints, your servers, your switches, your firewalls, your access points, they're all generating logs. When a cyber criminal carries out a ransomware attack, there is always a chain of information that is embedded within those logs. We see the cyber criminals get in, we see them escalate privileges, we see them move laterally, in other words, looking around the estate for other bits of interesting information. We might see that data being exfiltrated, so that data being stolen, and eventually we see the ransomware and we see the files being encrypted. Now, if you're not looking at that data, then the first thing you really find out is typically you get a ransom demand on your screen, you can't access certain files, you've got yourself a problem. But that trail of breadcrumbs is actually something that if you're looking at it effectively, you can thwart many attacks. It's not as easy as it might sound, because to interpret those logs, you need to be technically minded and actually be a skilled threat hunter. It's also quite difficult if you just rely on the native logs inside solutions, then depending on how many vendors you have in your estate, but it'll be a lot. You'll be looking at lots of different logs.
Lots of data, and it's not very friendly either. So.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So this is where platforms like XDR, industry acronym, Extended Detection and Response, basically somewhere that you can put all of your data in one place and then go searching through it. Or something like SIEM, where you have this big bucket of information. However, it still doesn't solve the problem from a human resources perspective that maybe you don't have the skills to look at that information effectively. And of course, you've got to do it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, because the cyber criminals will often launch their attacks outside of business hours because they know that that's a weak spot and people are not looking at the logs and data. And this is where services like managed detection and response come into play, where you're actually then looking at the information coming from your estate. And we provide that as a service. So rather than you employ your own threat hunters, you simply subscribe to our service and we start looking at the data from your estate. And we look for these little things like where the cyber criminals are getting in and what they're doing, those activities. And we use human intuition to bring it together and recognize that this is likely to be an attack. This is a much more affordable and sustainable way of having that eyes on glass expertise without actually having to hire anybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Because obviously, if it's your own organisation, it's not just that one security guy. They don't want to have holidays. They want to have weekends, evenings. That's terrible, but it's true. So you at least 2 people, probably 3, to cover those things, and then obviously they're going to look for other jobs. All sorts of things happen. So it's a big cost to a business. So driving to a service like MDR, someone's going to do that for you. That's a good option.
Absolutely. And there are other more basic things as well. So you may well think, well, why do I see 70% of attacks involving successful encryption of data? And this is because the cyber criminals will constantly be adapting. We've had ransomware for a long time now, and yet technology is not covering as we've seen there. And that's largely due to a particular new technique, which is remote ransomware. So to break it down really simply, this is where the cyber criminals will use a vulnerable device in the estate to launch their attacks against data that's stored somewhere else. So this might be an unprotected device, it might be an unmanaged device, or it may be badly configured in some cases. Or it could be something that just simply can't own endpoint protection, like a CCTV system.
IoT device, basically.
Exactly that, yeah. And what they do is they launch those attacks against other devices in the estate that actually have the interesting data on. Even those are protected, the vast majority of endpoint protection solutions only look for malicious code that's actually being run on the device they're protecting. Yep. So it's almost like an in at the side kind of attack. Sophos is one of a handful of vendors and the only one that's top right in the Magic Quadrant for endpoint protection that actually can look at the data itself and recognize whether it's being encrypted or not without really caring where that source came from. So we don't just look for malicious executions on the device that we're protecting. And that's a really important weapon against remote ransomware, which the cyber criminals have seen a lot of success from. So some things you can do with technology, but I'm going to emphasize again that if you look at the attack chain and you look at all those things like exfiltration, like escalation of privileges, mimicking users, deleting backups, these are all things that technology on its own is not going to detect.
No,
and
they're all discrete events that aren't necessarily suspicious on their own.
Exactly. And it's only when you get a threat analyst and that human brain looking at all this information, piecing it together, they can say, this is an attack. It's about to happen. This is what you need to do next. So if you look at the overall lessons we can learn from the State of Ransomware report, it is definitely pointed towards human-led threat hunting as the way to protect against these modern threats.
Yeah. And I think that integration as well, having the integration between your tools, that you can surface that holistic view of things.
Absolutely. That was one thing that we wanted to do from very early on at Sophos, is not just rely on our own endpoint protection, but also pull in data from other places, because you may not have Sophos from end to end, but it also gives us access to information that otherwise we simply wouldn't have. If you look at a business email compromise attack, for example, this is where the cyber criminals might go into your email settings and redirect all the interesting emails that have things like purchase orders and invoices, and then simply change the bank details and send them back to the original source. That is not going to be detected by antivirus, but we can use our integrations with Microsoft 365, for example, to recognize where dubious redirect rules have been put in place, and then we can query the user to say, well, is this something you wanted to do
this?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly that. Or alternative, looking at backups. So we talked about backups as being a great recovery mechanism. We know this. The cyber criminals know this too. And typically one of the first things they will go after is a backup, because if they can delete that, then the victim has
recovery options.
It does. It limits your recovery options. So we use that integration with backup vendors to check, has the scope of a backup been changed? Has the password been changed? Have backups been deleted or marked as clean from ransomware? These are all things that would generate cases, and we would actually call our customers and check to see if that is a legitimate change or a legitimate deletion, or is this the first sign that a cyber incident is about to occur. Exactly.
I think it brings us back round to what we've been saying anyway. So recovery plans are key, having that visibility of your estate. It's that recovery plan and understanding how the whole business is going to react if something does happen, but having that early warning of that integration, maybe a service like MDR, to actually highlight things before they become a problem.
Absolutely. The last thing you want to do is find out you're about to have a ransomware incident by seeing notes on your. It's too late at that point.
I mean, and say the recovery is getting faster, positive, but we'd rather not have to recover. We'd rather get in there before stop it.
Exactly that.
But, yeah, great chat again as always, John. We'll see you next time.
Look forward to it. Thank you very much.